Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond, from the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty. Our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
This is Yash with my co-host Shree, and today we're going to talk about some things you could do to prepare when you're at the interview stage of your application process. So, this is a kind of time when most students feel like they're severely kind of anxious and underprepared, and rightly so, because honestly, until you get to this point, you haven't really experienced anything like you're going to experience in this interview stage of specifically the BSMD application process. And I think it's something that's so unique to applying to BSMD that many of your peers at that age, and even yourself when you're applying to just traditional college programs, are not going to experience something like this. So it's just something we wanted to talk about and discuss and have kind of a casual conversation about our experiences when we were preparing for it, and some kind of like maybe pro tips that we had thought of solely based on like how we felt about it.
Yeah. And just to piggyback off that, I think that's a great introduction to what an interview for a BSMD program kind of feels like. It's like something that you've never done before, and a lot of trepidation and anxiousness goes into preparing for these interviews, just because, especially in the first one, I remember I was really scared before it, just because I knew I was going to be meeting some of the most accomplished high schoolers from across the country, and rightly so. Like, the BSMD programs are very competitive, but if you get an interview for a BSMD program, I think the imposter syndrome strikes fast. So it's important to remind yourself that you yourself are there and you're just as competitive of an applicant as everyone else. So even before you get there, you shouldn't psych yourself out. That being said, like, you should also put in the work and prepare accordingly. So that's hopefully what we're going to give you on this podcast. I think a question that could start off the conversation going was, at least in terms of your preparation, Yash, what did you think about the interview going into it, especially your first one, and how did you prepare? And then maybe I can kind of chime in with some of my thoughts, like preparing for my first interview.
No, definitely. That's actually a really good question to start with. So, to be quite honest, I had no idea what to expect when I got my first interview invitation. But until that point, the only interviews I had, like, honestly, probably in my life, were super informal, like, basically just getting to know you interviews. Like, I had a couple for volunteer research experiences in high school. Those are very casual. And then I had a couple, like, college alumni interviews, also pretty informal. Like, they're mainly just asking you about your activities and getting to know you. And it doesn't feel at the level of pressure that you feel when you get one of these invitations. For example, the first invitation I got, like right in the letter, it said like, you'll be meeting with 2 members of faculty, you'll be having a lunch with a bunch of students, and then you'll have another like lunch interview as well with another student. So that's like, right off the bat, 3 actual interviews, then 1 like pseudo interview in one day. That's something that honestly at first like intimidated me. But I did some research kind of on my own, and also just some people that I knew had gone through the application process before and was able to learn a little bit more, and that helped me calm down quite a bit. And I realized that one thing that like I took away from it a lot is, even though it's moduled very similarly after like a traditional med school interview, which is like what kids will be doing when they're 21, 22 applying to medical schools, even though it's moduled after that, they know you're a high school student at the end of the day. Like, they don't expect you to know everything that you would know at the age of like 21, 22. And they also are not they don't expect you to be as they obviously expect you to be professional, but they're not expecting like someone with as many accomplishments as someone who is at that kind of level of their life. So when I learned those 2 hard facts about the interview, that really helped me kind of calm down, as I said, and just made me feel more focused on what I had to do. I will say I put a decent amount of time preparing for the interview. The most helpful for me was having family or friends mock interview me. So you can find kind of like lists of questions that are pretty traditional for these kind of interviews. The most like common and basic one that you want to be able to answer is the why medicine question that we actually talked about a lot in the previous episode for the why medicine essay. And honestly, since I'd already wrote that essay, right, I had kind of a lot of the answers already. It's just about how are you going to turn that into a conversation. And then a lot of the other interview stuff is actually just really good interview prep for regular like jobs and like stuff in college as well, which I didn't know until I got to college. But when I saw like my peers and friends applying to clubs and applying to other jobs, I realized that all of those like interview kind of like tips and questions that they ask you, like basically like common stuff you hear about, like tell me about a time you failed, like that doesn't go away. That stays for a long time. So I mean, that was like kind of my intro to like what I like kind of my path of how I started thinking about it. I don't know if you had something, Shree, about how you started going about it.
I think you mentioned a lot of how you prepared for the interview, and I just wanted to say I agree with you about like it transferring to other parts of your life in terms of having that skill to express yourself in a professional manner and present yourself accordingly, and starting that off from such a young age. It can definitely help you later in your career, not only for high school, not even for college clubs and interviews, but also in medical school when you're applying to residency. So you're hopefully going to be 7 years down the line, or 8 years down the line applying for residency. If you started that foundation in terms of your BSMD application, then it just matures as you age, and it just becomes that much better when you're actually applying to an actual job in terms of your residency, and it comes off as very professional. That's something I wanted to reiterate, especially in your preparation. You mentioned mock interviews, which is a great way to get yourself familiarized with not only the why medicine, but why BSMD, characteristics you look for in a person, and these very intangible type of questions. When they ask you, they expect you to have an answer. Cliche as it is to say that, like, be prepared, but a lot of people say don't stick to a script. I would kind of argue the other way in terms of like, yeah, you shouldn't have a script per se, like you shouldn't be robotic, but you should know damn well what you're going to say, like when they're going to ask you that question, because it should be something that you have prepared beforehand in terms of you've thought about critically what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, where you failed. And these are kind of common questions that keep coming up in job interviews and BSMD interviews. So you should have a very good answer and a very good explanation why you're bringing up that particular strength.
Yeah, 100%. I think you said this, like people say don't have a script. I think for maybe not a script, but especially for that why medicine question that 100 out of 100 times you're going to be asked that question, you should have a story. Like you should have something ready, maybe a bullet points of things that you want to cover. That's not something that if I had to go in and kind of like free verse that or kind of go in blind and just kind of talk, I would definitely miss some key points and my answer would not be as strong. So, and I think that they're looking for that. They want to make sure that you like know that why you want to be a doctor, right? So definitely for that question, I'd structure it beforehand.
One thing that I also wanted to add is just know your place. Like obviously you're at a BSMD interview and you're talking with the people that you're maybe going to share a place at this medical school. So you might be talking to your future roommate. So just be cordial with the people that you're with, and also make sure that you know who you're talking to when you're doing these interviews. So I mentioned this on another podcast that I run, but I had like a horror story at one of the programs that I went to where I was kind of talking about my research and making sure that like knowing your research is like a big thing, because when I was talking about my research, it turned out that my interviewer was actually an expert on that topic. So he was very interested in learning more about my research. And obviously I didn't answer his questions to the best of my ability, or not the best of my ability, but like to his satisfaction. So it really hurt me for that interview. And unfortunately, it was my first interview, so I didn't know how in depth I should know your research. But whatever's on your resume, just know it inside and out, like in terms of, especially when it comes to research, because you never know when someone who's an expert will sit on the other side of that table and grill you on the minutia of like what exactly, like what cell line you used for your research paper, or why you chose a particular study design. So even though like you're a high schooler, they'll still expect you to have that kind of rigor. Obviously, my story is kind of unique. Like, you're probably not going to have an expert in that same topic across the table, but you might.
No, I actually think that's actually a really good point to highlight. I had that actually. I had someone who knew my research kind of inside and out, and even like knew of like the mentor that I was working with. And I wouldn't say I like completely butchered it, but I definitely did not know enough about what I should have known. Like, she definitely asked me questions that I could only like half answer, maybe a quarter answer, and I really regretted like not just completely. And that sometimes it's like stuff that you've done like a year and a half ago, and you're in like the middle of like college applications, and you might just forget about it, honestly. So it's just something you have to review. Knowing your resume inside and out is very, very important, because that's all fair game. And I think I don't know for a fact, but I think if they have someone on the interviewing committee, on the faculty who's willing to interview, who happens to have an interest in your field, they will match you for the interview. So it's not necessary that I guess it's not necessary that they're going to go out of their way to find someone who knows your research inside and out and put you with them, right? But I think if it's like pretty easy for them in their wheelhouse, then they're going to go ahead and do that, because they want, A, it's interesting for that researcher, and B, they want to like make sure that you kind of know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that knowing your research inside and out definitely is something that we should keep in your mind. But on the other hand, your research doesn't really define you, and your interest in medicine kind of makes you one-sided. So I kind of wanted to switch topics to a different part of the interview, but just as important. We were talking about strengths and weaknesses and failures, and we were kind of being very abstract about the things that they ask. But I think it would be cool to get into specifics about what intangible questions they ask during your interview. I know for me, I just wanted to highlight that they ask about ethical questions. So as a doctor, how do you feel about euthanasia? Or how do you feel about a certain ethical dilemma about do not resuscitate or do not intubate? And they give you like a patient case, and they ask you what to do with it, especially in the odd cases that you get a mini med interview, or like kind of different scenarios to tell what your treatment plan is as a doctor. So I thought those were interesting exceptions to the rule of just straight interviewing that I felt. What about you, Yash?
No, definitely. Those ethical questions come up. And then also, like, honestly, regular interview questions that I kind of touched on before. Stuff like, tell me about a time you failed. Like, tell me something that, like, you think is a strength of yours. And these, like, questions can seem kind of wishy-washy, and, like, can kind of be, like, swept under the rug, and you can think of them as unimportant. But I actually think, for me, I benefited the most from having like pretty solid answers to these questions. And the best tip that I got for these questions was honestly that for each answer, you should have a story. So like, if someone asks you like, what is your greatest strength? You can't just say like, oh, I'm really good at working with others, right? Like, every time that an interviewer asks you a question, especially one of these open-ended questions about your personality and about like something non-med related, I think it's great to have some kind of story ready that you can morph into like a bunch of different answers. Just because I think like showing is way better than telling. And obviously like in an interview, you're always telling, but telling with a story is like more like showing.
I think that's really great advice. And I just wanted to share one of the greatest piece of advice that I got. Obviously the story is one of them, but I think that in order to understand why you're telling these answers, you should kind of get into the interviewer's head and just realize that it's a conversation between you and them. So in order to establish a good connection with the interviewer, it has to be first and foremost a very friendly and amicable conversation. Too many times we kind of see the interview as an adversarial reaction in terms of, you have what I want that, so I'm going to go kind of head to head with other people in order to get that. So it's kind of not like that. It's much more like a conversation about a synergistic meeting of the minds than it is a you have what I want, let me get it type of interaction. For example, one of the questions that I got was about the most pressing problem in medicine today, and it was about current events. And it's not a question that is very tangible to science or medicine or something like that. It's a lot about policy and how physicians don't just practice in a vacuum. And I think that was one of my most favorite questions, just because first I like policy, so it plays into my interest, but also I was able to kind of display a passion for things outside of medicine, but still related to the science and the passion that I had for medicine. But I was able to kind of explain something that I was passionate about outside of medicine, and they could really see why I was interested in melding together policy, medicine, and technology.
I'm really glad you said that. I almost forgot about that. I think having something outside of like medicine, outside of school, outside of like even academics, just like an interest, a passion to talk about, whether it be like an interest that you had in policy, or like even an interest in sports that some people might have, like kind of like some people like cooking, anything really, any interest that you actually like and that you can actually talk about can help you make that bridge that you were actually talking about earlier. It's like about making that bridge from an interview to a conversation. Honestly, the more you can keep your interview as a conversation, the better it'll go for you. That's my strong opinion. Right now, actually, so I'm a first-year medical student, so is Shree, and we're just starting like patient interviews, which is obviously like a very different skill, right? Like now I'm the one like interviewing a patient and trying to elicit information from them, but still that those like same key components like keep coming up, that like they have information that you want to get from them, but you want to keep this conversation as like conversational, as friendly, like as nice as you can, all while like kind of doing your job of hitting all the key points. And that's actually like exactly how you should be thinking about like interviews for med school or jobs or anything. It's like, yeah, you want to like get your points out there, but at the same time, like this is another person you're talking to. It's not like a robot. So like if you can make that personal connection, like that's a great place to jump off from.
Yeah. And I think that even makes your answers a little bit better because you're more relaxed when you're telling it. Something that we didn't really touch on is people get nerves when they interview. I'm one of them. So my anxiety was like through the roof when I'm going for these interviews. And that can really trip you up, especially when you forget what you're going to say or you think you're looking like a fool. I just wanted to give the 2 cents that I was given. No one really cares about like how you look and like how you answer these questions, as long as you get the point across in a kind of relaxed manner. If you're visibly nervous, obviously like that throws people off just because they're thinking about, hey, if this kid's a doctor and he's acting nervous in front of patients, or he's acting nervous before like the interviewing skills that you were mentioning is going to not look as good as a doctor. So it's like you just have to think about like presentation, like we said before. And just if push comes to shove, just do that many more mock interviews before you go, just to prepare yourself for the eventual nerves that's going to come. Obviously, on the day off, you're going to be nervous. You're going to be thinking about all these different things. But if you've prepared yourself that many times, it just becomes that much easier to hit your stride during the interview.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that actually brings me to what I probably want to say last. Like my concluding thoughts is that if you're at this point, you should already feel pretty good about yourself. Like I know once you get like the invitation to interviews, most people just jump right into preparing and write about like stressing about the interview, which is honestly kind of what I did. But you should celebrate the fact that you got these interviews. Like so many kids apply to these programs and not everyone gets an interview. Like a very small subset of people will even get the interview, which should also help in terms of the thinking about like anxiety and nerves for this. If you start feeling like a kind of anxious or kind of stressed the day of the interview or leading up to it, just remember that you were picked from a large pool of candidates and that you are like the imposter syndrome, I'm sure sets in very early on. But that's something that you were picked to be there for. Like you belong, and just go out and just like kind of be yourself. And honestly, I know that's cliche, but I've seen that work, which is why I think people say it over and over again for decades.
Yeah. And my concluding thought is kind of on a different note. It's not kind of inspirational. It's more of like a more practical one where it's like just dress properly to these events. And it's just like, make sure that you get like a suit, make sure you get, or like if you're a girl, just make sure you have like all the necessary components to like your wardrobe when you're going, because these interviews are professional, and like you already know that. But
I bought my first suits for these interviews, actually. I still have them.
Same. And then I think that that's like my concluding thing, is just like to go out there and have a good time, in terms of you're going to be meeting people. Like, fun fact, I actually like met one of Yash's friends who's in his program right now during my interview, and like I friended him on Facebook and stuff. And it was funny how like my first conversation with Yash, I kind of brought him up and was like, oh wow, he was in my interview, now he's like attending the program. It was like kind of funny that we had that connection in common. And because some of the people that you meet, like you never know down the line, like they might show up like as colleagues or someone in your residency program even. So it's just like nice to have those connections while you're on the interviewing trail, because you'll see the same people over and over again if you're going to the same BSMD interview days.
Honestly, yeah. And enjoy the process. Like, how many other 17, 18-year-olds get to like kind of fly around the country wearing cool suits, going into like medical schools and hospitals and talking to doctors, just like, you know, appreciate it for a little bit.
Yeah. And I think that that's like a really great place to kind of end off our interview preparation podcast. I just wanted to let you guys know about our next podcast, which is going to be all about on the interview day, what should you do? How should you act? Like, what's going to happen? And that's going to be coming to you next time. So stay tuned. My name is Shree. That's Yash, my co-host. And catch us next time.
See you guys later.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and medschoolcoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.